Here's the thing. I have to be entirely upfront with the fact that I did not care for Dune Part 1. See, I get that it is a 2.5-hour effort to lay the foundation for what's to come, but it just doesn't do enough for me to exist on its own. You know? And so that's why for the last 2.5 years, I have reserved judgment on the film to see if the saga picks up. If after a 2.5-year intermission, we actually see what all the fuss is about. And now, here we are. Dune Part 2 is upon us. And the question is the hype justified? Let's not drag this out. We've got a lot to get into. Accompanying me on my review for this highly anticipated film is Doc Swinton's alter ego Triple Cask. It's a whiskey with a big presence, which makes me excited to share about it in this episode for a film with a rather big presence itself. This bottle was given to me by Doc Swinton's master blender, Jesse Parker, via a mutual friend of ours who had shared about this series with him. And that makes Doc Swinton's the first official whiskey sponsor of a Real Buzzed episode. Doc Swinton's is based in Washington State, and it is so cool to have such great whiskey blending talent here in the Pacific Northwest where I live. So, big thanks to my friend Braden for sharing about Real Buzzed. And thanks to Doc Swinton's for this wonderful bottle of whiskey, which I will be talking about here in a little bit. And big thanks to you for tuning in and watching my content. But now, the review you've all been waiting for. Today, I'm sipping on Doc Swinton's Alter Ego Triple Cask and reviewing the biggest film so far in 2024, Dune Part 2. Something you have to understand about Dune Part 2 before you go into it is that it's called Part 2 for a reason. Because strictly speaking, this is not necessarily a sequel to Dune Part 1, but rather the next part in the Dune story. Just like how I've always asserted that Lord of the Rings is just one long movie broken into 3 parts. Argue with me about this later if you want. Dune Part 1 is a very incomplete story. It's not meant to exist on its own. And the reason this is so important to know is because Part 2 takes no time to recap or remind audiences of the events in Part 1. It simply picks up where the story left off. So be sure to rewatch Dune Part 1 before going into your Part 2 screening. And see, I would call it 2 halves of a whole, but just so you're not surprised, there is a Part 3 in the works. So this film also isn't necessarily a complete story. However, Dune Part 2 certainly brings promises to fruition in a big and satisfying way. And that leads me into what I loved most about this movie, the sheer scale of it. Dune Part 2 goes big with this chapter of the story. The film is full of gorgeous cinematography that really capitalizes on how it frames big spaces, especially when it comes to combat and battle sequences throughout the film. And trust me, the action here in Part 2 is so much more riveting than what we got in Part 1. And then there's the sound design, which absolutely blew me away. It's a loud ruckus of a film with so much attention paid to how the sound makes the movie feel. In the right theater, scenes like this are not just big action sequences. They are immersive experiences that are quite literally earth-shaking. It's like unintentional 4D cinema, and look, if you want to make the most of this experience, do not miss seeing Dune Part 2 in IMAX. It's honestly incredible. And y'all, in this giant movie, little old Timothée Chalamet fills an extremely big role so well. Chalamet is a force to be reckoned with, and while I hadn't doubted his star power before, Dune Part 2 is the point where he earns so much respect from me as an actor who can do practically anything. There are a number of scenes where he totally commands the screen. Being the small, skinny dude he is, he looks like someone who would struggle being a mighty leader, and that's exactly the conflict he plays out in his role as Paul Atreides. But when he takes up that mantle, there is no denying who's in charge in this film. And rising to that occasion is an exceptional accomplishment that isn't just great for Chalamet as an actor, but absolutely crucial to the success of this saga. He's surrounded by an incredible supporting cast as well. The peaks and glimmers of Zendaya's presence as the Fremen character Chani in Part 1 pays off handsomely here in Part 2, where her role as a warrior and lover takes audiences on a whirlwind of a romance story. And the bad guys get even more menacing. Villains gain villains of their own as the hierarchy of ruthless, power-hungry monsters reaches an insurmountable fever pitch. Seriously, this film has so much going on. It's actually kind of surprising it's less than 3 hours long. But is Dune Part 2 perfect? Well, not entirely. Those riveting combat sequences I mentioned earlier can break suspension of disbelief with fight choreography that's not as tight and convincing as it could be for those who are critically analyzing the stunt work. And hawk-eyed viewers might not be as impressed with the visual effects of this film, although they're not nearly as bad or lazy as some of the superhero films we've seen recently. It can be apparent when sequences are comprised of green screen work or when details aren't quite detailed enough. But see, these notes are for the most critical among us. For the average moviegoer, Dune Part 2 is a blast, and those going in wanting a good time will likely not find these minor flaws at all a distraction. I certainly had a great time with this film, just constantly leaning into what's going to happen next and being present in the atmosphere and immersion of this whole Dune universe. Dune Part 2 is another stunning sci-fi achievement from director Denis Villeneuve, and honestly, it's a film that could go down as one of the greatest sci-fi sequels of all time. Despite my apathy for Part 1, Villeneuve has proven once again here in Part 2 that he is a master of epic sci-fi cinematic filmmaking. And Dune Part 1 finally has a whole new life in my head as I find myself eager to spend over 5 hours double featuring these two films until we are graced with Part 3, which I am now expecting to be nothing less than exceptional. Speaking of exceptional, let's talk about this whiskey. Even before I took a sip, I could already smell that I was gonna like this one a lot. The sweet, toffee, nutty aroma is a delightful prelude to the tasting experience. I don't know if this makes sense, but it's like your nose indulging in a piece of candy before you take a sip. And it's interesting because, as oxymoronic as it might sound, when you do sip, it's a bold hit with like subdued flavors. It's very forward with its dry, nutty characteristics, but also hits your mouth with a robust spiciness. And the lingering warmth is a characteristic I really appreciate. It just makes the sip last that much longer for me, and I really like that effect it has. It leaves a lasting impression, something Doc Swinton's whiskey and the Dune franchise both have in common. Dune Part 2 hits theaters March 1st, but I know that there have been early fan screenings, so if you've seen Dune Part 2, or if you plan to see it, drop a comment and share what you thought about the film. This is Real Buzzed. Be wise, drink responsibly, and if you like this video and you want to see more, hit like and subscribe.